Okay, let's move on to a third project that we are doing together. This is one that's actually going to be written by a Young Academy Award winner whose name is Christopher Angel, who has written a fantastic screenplay of his own called Orwell. He's also written a great novel called The Mona Lisa Speaks, and he was working on the award-winning documentary. I think it was called Raising Bismarck, which won awards with James Cameron.
James Cameron.
Now, I've met Christopher quite a few times, but let's talk about To Asmara. I've been fascinated with Ethiopia and Africa. Of course, some of the big movies to come out of African stories have been Blood Diamond, Last King of Scotland, Hotel Rwanda. To Asmara, I read as a book, fascinated me because it was very character driven. But at the same time, it was looking at a people and a part in history not too long ago, in the 1980s, made famous by the Live Aid concerts and the help of the Ethiopian famine. But the true story behind what happened is what is interesting, because for once, the whole world seemed to be against an innocent people, including the Russians and the Americans on the same side. And the Ethiopians, who the money was being raised for, seemed to, without getting political here, misappropriated some of the funds that were meant for the Eritreans.
The generosity of the world flowed in.
So tell me a little bit about the story of the book. And
Yeah.
obviously we're going to make that into a screenplay this year too. But I think it will be a great movie and different from the biopic on American Scoundrel, different from the tragedy of the Great Hunger, but a pertinent look at four characters, each with their own story, which we'll go into in a moment, making a journey to Asmara, which at the time was the Eritrean capital in the middle of a war between the Ethiopians and the Eritreans, which never really finished, did it?
And nearly, no, I was back there in 2000 when it broke out again. It is fascinating that the aid agencies couldn't afford to let us know that the Ethiopians, the Ethiopian government of Mengistu, through no fault of the Ethiopian people who deserved to be helped, but Mengistu was, while we were trying to help him out, neglecting part of his population and fighting a war on a huge scale in Eritrea. And that war was nearly unreported, because if you wanted to, he didn't like journalists going to the front and discouraged them from. And if you wanted to go to the Eritrean side, you had to go to the Sudan, which is a basket case country, as you know, travel to Port Sudan by truck or aircraft, and then go into the highlands of Eritrea from the Sudan by truck. And you could only travel by night.
Yeah.
When you were in there, there were no faxes, there were no, you were stuck there until you'd finished your tour, and then until a truck was available to take you out. Right. You might come out with, say, a bloke on the floor who'd lost both legs.
What's going to be appealing to the audience to watch this film?
Well, these people, the Eritreans, who tragically now are still going through hell, were fighting for their freedom against the Ethiopian army, the Soviet-aided Ethiopian army. You'd see, I mean, Russian bombers came over every day, and that's why you couldn't move by day. So the Russians were on their side and were selling them armaments.
And this is
in
going
the midst
on,
of a famine.
So this is going on whilst the world is raising money for the Ethiopians. They are using the money to buy Russian MiGs, Russian weapons,
tanks, 88mm cannon,
and bomb a people that are very poorly armed.
Yeah, I was stuck in a town called Nakfa for a week with the Eritreans, who really struck you. Now, the Eritreans reminded you of the American rebels.
With the spotlight of the world on Ethiopia at this time, why was this not reported at the time to people around the world?
Because it was so hard for journalists to get in there, because and the aid agencies felt if we tell people that this mongrel, Mengistu, is, while we're feeding his people, he's spending money on Russian armaments, then people won't give.
Right.
And it's essential that they give. So there was a bit of a conspiracy to cover it up for good reasons.
Surely the alternative would have been to overthrow the dictatorship in Ethiopia,
yes,
replace it with a democratic, which is what effectively happened.
Which is what
in
happened
Iraq,
because, yes.
Although it didn't work
and
out.
indeed, the Ethiopians ultimately, the Eritreans, of whom no one's heard, took on this Russian Air Force and Ethiopian army, and they beat them.
Right.
Russian advised Ethiopian army. So you couldn't help but admire them. But
sounds a bit like Vietnam, doesn't it?
Yes, and it was. But the people were so together, and it was quite. I was scared all the time I was there, but it was intoxicating to be there. And when I got out, I was so pleased. And the next year, I was asked to make a documentary there for Melvyn Bragg, Lord Bragg of London Week on Television. Yeah. So I went back in with a camera crew and my wife, who's a soldier. I'm not a soldier, I'm a wimp. My wife is the tough guy. And we went back and made a documentary. And what happened was you came in and everything was hidden. You hid by day and traveled by night. You would see a lot of wounded and sick arrive at the bigger base hospital that was dug into the cliffs of of a place called Arota. So it looked like a desolate valley in Nevada or Central Australia, and yet it would be you walk in and containers would be dug into the side of the cliff. And in those containers, there would be operations going on. They did eye operations, they did maxillofacial operations, because one of the worst things about warfare are the wounds where people lose 3/4 of their face.
Now, there have been talks, and there was a lot of discussion in the book about chemical weapons being used and the denial of it. And one of the captors that they had felt that he wasn't aware, and he certainly didn't use them. And he almost wanted to turn against his own people because he believed that what the Eritreans was doing right. And one of the other interesting facts of the book for me was that
he was a bomber pilot that I met, an Ethiopian bomber pilot of a Russian plane.
Now they were educating their children in English, in etiquette, in the trenches. So it wasn't
in the most barbarous places.
So it wasn't a barbaric tribe in Africa. It was an educated people with principles and etiquette and goodwill.
You'd sit down in some hole in the earth with an Eritrean officer, and you'd find he had an MBA from Louisiana State or from Northwestern, or these were people that were passionate about a number of things, including trying to end female circumcision. A lot of the Ethiopian rebels were women, and they were raising them to, when they had daughters, that these daughters wouldn't be subject to the traditional female circumcision, which is traditional. It's not Islamic. It's both Christians and Muslims practice it in East Africa. And of course it creates great medical problems for women, and it creates great gynecological problems all their life, and it probably shortens their life. And so this was the sort of thing that these people were trying to rise above. Now, they were manufacturing. I was there so often on a number of visits. You walk in to the side of a mountain, and they had a laminar flow sterilization plant. And they were also making, so they could make surgical drips, the sort of thing you have in your arm after an operation. They could make glucose drips and so on. They could make antibiotics. They were making antibiotics in holes in the mountains. And why were they doing that? They had donations. For example, their pill-making machine came from Italy. It was slightly old-fashioned pill-making machine that the Italians were finished with. It used to be an Italian colony, so the Italians have been a bit generous to them. And people in full laboratory gear were working in these places in the sides of the mountains. And of course, what was most impressive was the place of the women, all this. I have a woman character in there with whom the visitor to Eritrea, for whom the visitor to Eritrea falls. And so this was an extraordinary war. You couldn't believe it wasn't reported, but it was Africans killing Africans, so who gives a damn about that? And it was like Vietnam in that there were front lines. I've been to the front line a number of times, but the Eritreans also operated and caused merry hell in the lines of communications. They used to go out into the lines of communications. And this book ends with an Eritrean raid on the airport at Asmara. Now, ultimately, the Eritreans won this war, and they had democracy for a time, or the hope of democracy and equity, and it all ended up going sour because the great rebel leader, as in the case of Mugabe, became a tyrant. And he's a bloke I knew, but we didn't know that then. A friend of mine, an eye doctor, was so impressed with them that he raised the money to put a lens manufacturing. You know the lenses that go in your eyes? He put a lens manufacturing installation on front of their laminar flow sterilization plant and started producing European quality eye lenses that were put into people that needed cataract operations. And therefore, this is the sort of people they were. They were just hugely impressive, brave, educated. Now, I got heat exhaustion once. This is the sort of thing that happens in the novel too. I don't think this incident is in the novel. I got heat exhaustion there. They carried me into a bunker behind the front line. When I came round, I was making a documentary. The sound man had heat exhaustion too. They put some electrolyte fluid in our veins. And when I woke up, there were a number of young soldiers, Eritrean soldiers, men and women, in the bunker. And there was a map of the wall, on the wall. And because I'm Australian, he said to me, we've been waiting for you to come round. We wondered, could you tell us about the Australian constitutional and political structure? And so 150 yards behind the front line, which was on the top of a mountain, and this was just down the slope a bit, I was giving a lecture on the Australian Senate and the Australian House of Representatives. And I thought, this is crazy, but this is Eritrea. And that's the weirdness that I try to convey in the novel, and I think would be part, as well as the love story and the bravery of the Eritreans. I see it as a bit like a latter-day farewell to arms. And it got a front page review in the New York Times, and the reviewer...
Do we have a copy of the book here? Is it behind you? Let me just have a...
I didn't bring it today, but you've got a copy.
I've got To Asmara. Is it behind you on the...
It's on the table, I reckon.
Right, let's have a close-up look at the book. Right, so here we are.
And what the reviewer said, he was wrong, but he said that this is the most important book about Westerners observing a war since A Farewell to Arms, which was nice. Didn't help the sales a lot, but it was nice.
Now, the interest in this for Global Watch Films and for myself, so I'm interested in this story. We are already doing an epic about the Irish potato famine called The Great Hunger, which we have a screenplay which we're developing, that screenplay which will be ready for an A-list director.